Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Stetson Kennedy, and I'm really glad to be able to introduce Mr. Paul Ortiz, Dr. Paul Ortiz, the head of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Project, and a good partner with us, and a partner of all progressives in Gainesville, and he's going to talk to us about Stetson Kennedy's America. Paul?
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I would be remiss if, I think we would be remiss if we didn't spend just a few moments thinking about where we are, the location, surrounded by books. A big theme of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, really three things: reading, investigative research, and writing. Stetson Kennedy had an incredibly multidimensional career and life in the struggle, but tonight I really want to focus in on those three areas: reading, research, and writing. And the fact that we can meet here like this as a community of friends, of comrades, of colleagues, next-door neighbors is thanks to the Civic Media Center. And I just want to acknowledge and actually ask anyone who is staff or has ever volunteered or helped the CMC to stand and be acknowledged, please. We are so blessed in this community to have a place like the CMC, and you don't sometimes remember this until you go and travel to other towns and other parts of the country that don't have places like the CMC, which is most of the rest of the United States of America, right? But to keep the CMC going and moving, it needs resources, right? And you know I'm going to make a pitch because I love the CMC. My wife and I are both members and long-term supporters, but what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to pass the box around, and I'm going to begin by pulling out $5. This is not Monopoly money, by the way. This is real cash. And I'm going to challenge folks to try to either match this contribution or surpass it. If not tonight, because I realize you didn't come here thinking that Paul Ortiz was going to do the shakedown, right? But if you can't give tonight, please consider giving in the near future, because this place, I mean, look at these books. Stetson loved books. If there's one kind of experiential fact you know about Stetson Kennedy, you know he loved books. In fact, often he had more than one copy of a book, right? I think he had 3 copies of my book, Emancipation Betrayed. And what that tells us is the revolutionary inherent potential of not just books, but people getting together. And so the CMC provides a space not only for people to read and learn about these radical traditions that Stetson wrote about, but to talk about it, to get together, to organize. So I'm going to start by putting my $5 in the box and pass it around. And I will not be peeking out of the side of my eye to see whether or not you've donated or not. But I did want to also announce Stetson's, what we're calling Stetson's last new book. Now, this is a very important book that's coming out, and I'm going to pass around the announcement. It's called The Florida Slave: Interviews with Ex-Slaves, WPA Writers Project 1930s, and Testimony of Ex-Slaves, Joint Congressional Committee, Jacksonville, 1871. I cannot stress the importance of this book. If you are interested in the history of Florida and you want to know why this state elected this messed up guy that we have as governor, and you want to know why the legislature in Tallahassee is so messed up, you've got to read this book, because it's all rooted in the histories of slavery and Reconstruction. Research. Stetson was fond of saying that the 1930 census was the most revolutionary document in American history. What did he mean by this? He meant that if you sat down and you did hard research through the 1930 census, through all of its unpublished manuscript schedules, its reports on disease, its breaking certain things down by race in terms of poverty and inequality, its reports on things like rickets and pellagra in white communities, and the fact that the Jim Crow South, in many cases, was incredibly oppressive and detrimental to white folks, as well as black folks, and to Hispanics as well. That's why Stetson said the 1930 census was so revolutionary. If you sat down and you looked at it and you carefully went through it, you could find all the information you needed to start a revolution. If you sit down with the 2010 census today, brothers and sisters, you can do the same thing. And what Stetson did with the Florida Slave is he resurrected a document which he himself did not create, but which was testimony taken during Reconstruction about the origins and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Florida. Now, the Klan in Florida, and I'll just pass this a second. Y'all can keep that. That's just an announcement. But this book is coming out any day now, and I really suggest you check it out. The 1871 hearings on the Ku Klux Klan in Florida mirrored 12 other hearings that were going on throughout the former Confederate states. They burst a lot of myths about the Klan. I mean, one myth about the Ku Klux Klan is that it was an organization of kind of impoverished white folks, ignorant, rednecks, crackers. You've heard all of these stereotypes. In fact, witness after witness, and most of the witnesses were African Americans, but there are also white folks who testified from different economic backgrounds. Witness after witness basically said that the Ku Klux Klan in Florida, during its most murderous phase, was directed by the wealthiest plantation owners in the society. And another myth was that no one knew who was in the Klan because they wore those sheets, right? You didn't know the identities of these people. And there was even a racist myth that said that, well, the only reason black people were afraid of the Klan was they were superstitious and they thought the Klan were ghosts. In fact, again, witness after witness basically said, I knew who came to attack me. I knew who came to rape me. I knew who came to murder me and my family. I knew who came to burn down my house and drive my family and my people off the land. It was Mr. Ron Jones or Mr. John Giffords. I knew who these people were, and I told them, you can't disguise yourself with a sheet. I know who you are. And furthermore, I know you didn't buy that fine white Arabian stallion. I know you didn't buy that brand new Winchester rifle because you can't afford it. And so the point I'm trying to make is that Stetson brought back the testimony from 1871 to make a critical point about how racism works in the society. Stetson was very concerned about certain critiques and analyses of racism. And I want to point out, now y'all probably don't think I can get through these books in 30 minutes, right? I'm going to do it. Stetson talked about a book called American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal. I'm going to pass this around. As an academic, I love this book. It's full of interesting facts and anecdotes and statistics about race in the 1940s. But it has an analysis of race, and I talk about this in the piece that I wrote in memory of Stetson, which came out in Facing South and now has been republished in several different venues. But you can find it in the Southern Studies blog if you want to read kind of a longer analysis of this. Stetson had a lot of problems with that book, and he mentioned it in our last interview. And what he said to me was, Paul, they spent millions on the research to put this book together. And it was foundation supported. You know, all the kind of do-good liberals got together and put money into a study. They had the best intentions at heart. They wanted to do something about racism. But he said they missed the mark. They reduced the problem of racism to a problem of education. They said all we had to do was just simply educate people, and they would stop being racist. It's kind of a simplification of what Stetson said. But what he was saying also is that Myrdal's implication in the book is that education and good political leadership will kind of steer the country out of racism. And if you read Stetson's work in contrast, especially Southern Exposure, you'll see that Stetson says very carefully, education is not enough because it isn't ignorance that is driving much of what we would see as racism. It's economic advantage. It's economic gain. It's that Jim Crow and segregation and apartheid, whether you're talking about South Africa in 1966 or the United States in 2011, is profitable. You make money off of it. So how do you make racism unprofitable? You strike, you boycott, you do the types of things, the types of activities that Stetson supported in the 1960s during the direct action phase of the student sit-in movement. So research is really important to Stetson, and that's why I think in his last book, he brings back, he republishes in essence that the 1871 Klan hearings. I mean, brothers and sisters, this is hard reading. I challenge you to read it. It's page after page, terrible atrocities. This is the most violent, brutal political period in American history. And the whole goal of the Ku Klux Klan was to disenfranchise African Americans, to take the vote away from them, and to terrify white Americans away from associating with black people. It really isn't about, and Stetson said this often about segregation, and this is certainly in his book, The Jim Crow Guide. What he says about this is that if you look at the American Southeast and you look at the American Southwest, you'll see similar structures of oppression which emerged really in the 19th century, but in the early 20th century, and let me, in both these two books, and if you want to get to know Stetson, this is a major theme tonight, you have to read him, okay? And so I'm going to give everyone here tonight a charge, and I'm going to say, read Southern Exposure as an introduction. If you want to start a Stetson Kennedy reading group, call me, email me, get a group of folks together. This will be an experience of your lifetime. I mean, not hanging out with me. My students can tell you that. But the Jim Crow Guide is a wonderful guidebook, and it points out the kind of sense of humor that Stetson had. How many of you read those, when you travel, you read those like rough guides, or what are some of the companies that make these guidebooks?
Lonely Planet.
Lonely Planet, yeah, exactly. Well, Stetson was responsible. He was the head of the WPA Writers Project in Florida. He worked with Zora Neale Hurston. Most of us are familiar with that. But part of what the WPA was doing in the 30s under the New Deal was creating these guides, these writers' guides. And the idea, part of it was premised upon the notion of trying to get people to come and visit Florida, trying to get people to come and visit Georgia, or whatever state you were working in. Now, to understand Stetson Kennedy's America, you have to take a step back. When you read Southern Exposure, when you read Jim Crow Guide, when you read Palmetto Country, which I'm going to talk about next, Florida was in a disastrous state of political and economic chaos between the end of Reconstruction and World War II. Now that continued, but that period in time in which Stetson is doing his field work is a period of time in which Florida looks much more, and I hate to use this phrase, but I'm just going to use shorthand here, so I apologize in advance. Florida during that period of time, brothers and sisters, was really a third world country. It was tremendously economically underdeveloped. And Stetson made the point in Southern Exposure, and people didn't believe him then, but as in so many other things, he was prescient about this. Stetson said that until white supremacy in Florida and Alabama and Georgia and these other places was knocked down a few notches, until white supremacy was challenged, that Florida would always remain marginal, underdeveloped, undercapitalized. Its industries dominated and controlled and run from Wall Street. And that was true. If you think of turpentine and phosphate and timber and the railroads, all of these are controlled from outside of the state. C. Van Woodward sets the stage for us. He talks about how every Southern railroad was capitalized and owned almost without exception outside of the state. But they'd always be polite enough to hire some aging Confederate colonel to be the spokesperson, right? That's how smart these Yankees are, right? They always find some Confederate colonel to be the figurehead of that railroad. In reality, all of the wealth was being drained out of states like Florida and Georgia, going directly into New York. Stetson wrote about this, and again, he said, until we challenge racism and knock it down a few rungs, we're going to forever remain an underdeveloped part of the country. Now, Stetson was not the person who created this critique or this analysis. That analysis, by the way, goes back to Reconstruction. It goes back to the populist movement. It goes back to people like A. Philip Randolph. It goes back to people like T. Thomas Fortune, land, labor, and capital in the South. T. Thomas Fortune, a Floridian, an African-American. If you want to learn about the history of the state, read that book. T. Thomas Fortune lays it all out in 1884. He said racism has become a system. Even in 1884, he saw ahead. He said racism has become a system used to divide white workers and black workers. And who are the winners? Who are the beneficiaries? Now, Fortune was not a Marxist. He was not in the Communist Party. He wasn't even in the ISO. I don't think they had the ISO back then. But, so Stetson, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that Stetson began his field work in a state which was economically impoverished. When I was interviewing African Americans in Florida who came of age in the Great Depression, I asked them, what kind of impact did the Great Depression have on the black community in Florida? And they looked at me, they were very tolerant, they were very kind, and they said, well, young man, it didn't really have an impact because we always were living in the Great Depression. Didn't you know that? Which is pretty true. If you look, again, look at the census, look at the poverty levels, look at the schooling levels. Again, that's why Stetson stressed this kind of research, and that he said until you address these issues, you're going to have a state which is underdeveloped. And in fact, it's the civil rights movement which does more for the state of Florida, much more in terms of the state of Florida's economic development, than it does for African Americans, frankly, because African Americans in Florida are still waiting to accrue many of the rewards of the movement and the struggle that they fought for and gave their lives for. But it sure as heck helped out Florida, because suddenly Florida became a much better place to live in. It became less violent. It became more tolerant. It became a place where you didn't have to worry about driving down a dusty road and having a sheriff pull you out and beat the tar out of you, okay? If you look at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, we have an interview with a man named Haas Manussi, who he was the head of the St. Augustine Ancient City Gun Club. Stetson knew him very well, and he knew Stetson. And the anecdote that I'm going to tell you illustrates this point I'm trying to make, which is that every Florida county had a Haas Manussi. Every Florida county had a sheriff like the guy they had in Groveland. Willis McCall. We have an interview with Willis McCall in the oral history program at UF. Again, I invite you to read these interviews. These were brutal men. They ran the state like it was their own fiefdom. In fact, this book was published in 1891. It's called The American Siberia. Guess what state it's set in? Florida. Guess what it's about? Slavery. In the industrial system, right? What else? But I thought slavery ended in 1865. Peonage, yeah. J.C. Powell, who wrote American Siberia, and obviously there's a whole genre of American literature in which you go to Siberia under Tsarist Russia, and you do these exposés of how brutal those slave labor camps were there, and they were brutal. But friends, when you look at the pictures and the drawings of how African Americans and even working class whites were being exploited and brutalized and murdered, again, outside companies coming into Florida. if you're a black man standing on a street corner Saturday afternoon and Sheriff Willis McCall comes up to you and he says, well, it looks like you're unemployed and Farmer Joe needs some labor to pick some oranges. And so he arrests you, and he can arrest you because Florida has a very open-ended vagrancy law, okay? And it's these types of institutions, convict labor, the debt lease, or the convict lease, debt peonage, which characterize Florida. And in the American mind, and again, this is the Florida of Stetson Kennedy's youth. In the American mind, our state is in fact associated with convict labor. How many of you have seen that famous Burt Reynolds film, Longest Yard? That's set where? How many of you seen I Was a Prisoner or I Was a Fugitive from the Chain Gang? Yeah, I mean, all of these stories, these exposés are set, not all of them. I mean, a few of them are set in god-awful Georgia, but most of them are set in Florida. And this was the kind of terrain that Stetson Kennedy grew up in. And this morning, I was interviewed by a young, very promising journalism student at the University of Florida. And I was trying to think of what to say. And I said, what I want you to try to think about is where does American writing and journalism and media fit in with the American system? What I meant by this was that during the period of slavery and Jim Crow, and now we're talking about 4 centuries of history, a key part of implementing and perpetuating that system was the American media promulgating stories about how slavery was so beneficial, how Jim Crow was the best system for all races. In fact, media played a leading role. The Florida Times-Union, without the Florida Times-Union, it's hard to see how Jim Crow in Florida would have been so almost seamlessly implemented. The railroad newspaper, you know, David Yulee and that particular outfit. And so I asked this journalism major to think about writing as either an exercise to prop up and support the status quo, or writing and journalism as a way to challenge the status quo and to trend towards a democratic society, a small d democratic society, the society of equality and justice, and the role that writing and research plays in that. That's who Stetson was. I mean, he was many different things, but tonight we're thinking about him really, or I'm thinking about him as a writer and an investigative reporter who pursued the truth wherever it took him and made people around him uncomfortable. When I think of Letter from Birmingham Jail, that magnificent essay by Martin Luther King Jr., and we think about the audience that was aimed at. What audience was Dr. King writing to in Letter from Birmingham Jail? Clergymen and liberal white friends. I mean, he wasn't writing to the Ku Klux Klan. And I think that Stetson had a similar audience. I mean, he's not, I don't think Stetson was trying to convert Willis McCall to freedom, justice, and equality, right? I think he's really writing to people like us and people like myself, people who see injustices occurring on an everyday basis, but are kind of afraid to talk about them or even to think about them. You know, he was writing to people who are trying, you know, to kind of say, well, you know, we don't like homelessness. We feel bad for people who are homeless, but we don't like people using St. Francis here because they may be attracting crime, okay? Those are the types of folks that Stetson is writing towards. He's saying, wait a minute here, there's a problem. Now, I never heard Stetson talk so much about religion, but a certain kind of religion pervades his entire writing. If you looked at most of the great religious faiths that I've studied, there are 3 bottom line rules. I mean, this is certainly true in all the Abrahamic religions. Number 1, how do you treat the stranger in your community? That is a foundational question, right? Ethical question. Number 2, how do you treat others who are less fortunate? Okay, and then number 3, more generally speaking, what do you do about problems in your society, about inequities, injustices in your society? That's why when I think of Stetson's work, I think of work which is in many ways deeply religious, even though religion isn't necessarily, an adamant part of the work. Palmetto Country was published in 1942. This is a book that's going to blow your mind about Florida. My argument to all community organizers and social justice activists is you have to learn, if you want to change things in the locale that you're living in the state, in the country, in the place, you've got to learn something about the culture of the place. And Palmetto Country is an excellent primer on the state of Florida. And it has these wonderful accounts of humanity's interaction with nature. One of the things Stetson was always concerned about, and if I can get a copy of that copy of Southern Exposure back, I'm going to read a passage from it, if you could pass that back up to me. Stetson, especially later in life, had an emphasis on environmentalism. And this is an aspect that we should not underplay. And I'm actually going to read a passage for you, if I can find it. Actually, let me get the Jim Crow Guide back, because the Jim Crow Guide is an even better passage. One of the things that irritated people about Stetson was that he never accepted the pace of social change that surrounded him. He was never satisfied. And whereas a lot of his colleagues and friends said, wow, look at all the great progress we made in race relations and gender relations and accepting and tolerance, Stetson would just kind of shake his head. And you can see it in this following passage. And this is in an update of the 1990 version of Jim Crow Guide. He says the following: "The South, the nation, and the world have all changed a great deal since this Jim Crow Guide was written, originally in the 50s. But at times for the better, but not always. As someone has said, the forms of exploitation change from time to time. In our time, the constraints set forth in this book, which long rendered blacks and other minorities second-class citizens, have to an appreciable degree been overcome, but in some instances have only been relaxed, modified, refined, or supplanted. Lynch mobs have given way to death row, and chain gangs to concentration camps for black males. Massa and Mr. Charlie," and I'll kind of go down here a little lower, he said, when American blacks graduated from picking crops, our borders relaxed to admit new peons. Peonage in place of slavery is not so conspicuous now, but many multinationals are as much slavers as Old Master ever was. And some dark-skinned peoples of the Third World are as much slaves as Uncle Tom was. The free world's bosses decided to leave them and work them where they're at." And let me skip down to his conclusion here, because it gets us to this question of humanity and nature. He says, "Let me conclude on a note concerning not the prospects of this or that race, but of the human race, and more importantly, of the planet Earth." And remember, this is written in 1990. "If we go on turning the good Earth into a wasteland and all its seas into dead ones, we might as well hang up the human rights banner and prepare for the end. Talk about a long minute, that will be it. Come the apocalypse, it will be too late to mutter about all the good deeds we intended to do come Brotherhood Week. As a result of our actual doings, there are any number of things happening which, if we do not cease and desist, will render moot such relative trivia as race relations." That's a profound statement from a man whose entire career and life was consumed by studying race relations. In other words, he's saying if we don't take care of the earth we live in, everything is going to be moot. "This is not to say," he continued, "that we should abandon our struggle for justice, but only that we need to assign a certain priority to saving the world as a stage for its realization. Otherwise, the only question would seem to be how we're going to do ourselves in by fire, water, poison, depletion, or some combination thereof. Please be assured that achieving integration and equalization by atomization is not a viable way to go. Nor, given a global flood brought on by the greenhouse effect, 1990, by the greenhouse effect, will it do any good for us critters to line up 2 by 2, because there will be no fleet of arks or spaceships waiting for us to hop on board, and no Mount Ararat to take us to. So that's Stetson Kennedy in essentially the conclusion to a book about race relations, demonstrating the connection between human social relationships and our relationships to the natural environment. I think I have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to go through the last 5 books, and I'm going to start with a wonderful book which updates, I think, and I think, I don't know if Stetson ever commented on this, Sandra, but I think that this book really fits in with the legacy of Stetson's work. It's titled The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. It's really an essential book to understanding this new system. Remember, Stetson says that racism never goes away, it just changes form. Lynch mobs become mass incarceration, and he challenges us, he pushes us on this. And Michelle Alexander takes us more deeply into the contemporary system of Jim Crow racism. After Appomattox, how the South won the war. You say, well, the South didn't win the war. Talking about the Civil War, right? Stetson has something otherwise to tell us, and again, it's a very important cultural point he's trying to make, that when we talk about the Civil War, we need to reclaim it. This is one of the major themes in this book. He says we've given up the narrative of emancipation and black liberation and the narrative of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is the jewel of our Constitution. It is the capstone and the foundation. And without the 14th Amendment, you might, whatever you think of the Constitution, if you take the 14th Amendment out of it, the whole thing just dries up and blows away. And there is no guarantee, even on paper, of equal rights under the law. This is why the reactionaries right now are going at the 14th Amendment, right? They're trying to whittle away at it, and they're using what? Racism. Oh, I'm not a racist, but they're illegal, okay? And they're having children here, and we just want to modify the 14th Amendment a little bit to prevent that from happening. Well, that is a catastrophe in waiting, and if we allow that to happen, then we deserve every bad thing that happens to us. If we allow the 14th Amendment to be crushed and destroyed, then we are lost at sea. This was an amendment that 200,000 African American soldiers who went on battlefields knowing that if they were captured by the Confederate States of America troops, they would be tortured and executed on the spot. And this is an amendment that people like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Angela Grimke, the list can go on, fought and bled and suffered for. Most of them living lives where they were completely cast out by their friends. But they held the line. And so after Appomattox is trying to tell us that in some ways, we've surrendered the whole story of the Civil War. And we kind of gave it to the old Confederate folks. And we said, okay, you can celebrate Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest. In fact, we have a high school in Jacksonville that was renamed for the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest. It was renamed for the founder of the Ku Klux Klan just months after Brown v. Board was passed. Still bears that name. Is it heritage or is it hate? Or is it both? Now, let me go through 3 more books. I'm down to 3 books. I have 5 minutes left. You want to learn about Reconstruction, and you want to know where to go. So I've already passed around Palmetto Country, 2 chapters in that book on Reconstruction. Wonderful chapters, really. And other than Stetson Kennedy, and Stetson Kennedy wrote that book in 1942, he was one of the only people in the United States of America who saw Reconstruction as a positive movement of black enfranchisement. And the other one who did it on a grander scale was W.E.B. Du Bois. And you need to read this book, of Reconstruction, but it also talks about what happens when Reconstruction fails and when African Americans are disenfranchised. And what Du Bois says in the book, and this is a point that Stetson made frequently, is understanding the linkage between oppression in the United States and oppression in other countries. And what Du Bois says is that when African Americans lost the right to vote and when Southern white supremacists triumphed by the 1890s, it was a catastrophe of equal proportions for people in the United States and for people in Africa, in India, in the Philippines, and all the other places. Because what it did was it disempowered or crippled a huge proportion of the American working class, which would not have supported imperialism or colonialism in these other countries. And so that's why he says that the defeat of Reconstruction in the United States was a catastrophe for people in Latin America. Think of the Spanish-American War. That's kind of the proof of the pudding. I'm going to save you some time. If you want to learn about Reconstruction in Florida, do not read this book. William Watson Davis's Civil War and Reconstruction in Florida. I've read it 3 times. It's not a fun read. But it is the read, it's the book which the state of Florida wanted you to read because it was written in 1913. It had the racist interpretation of slavery. Slavery was a good thing. The Civil War, the Noble South would have won. It was betrayed, so on and so forth. And Reconstruction was a terrible disaster for white people. And years later, white people are still trying to get their country back. The book was written in 1913. In 1964, the state of Florida picked 12 books to commemorate its quadricentennial. 12 books which were supposed to make up the capstone of the history of the state. Guess which book they picked to tell the story of Reconstruction? This book. This is the only book I'll ever tell you to not read, right? Probably, at least tonight. The last book I want to share with you is a book by another wonderful person, Howard Zinn. And this is one of these books which I think is absolutely critical in understanding a person like Stetson Kennedy. It's titled On Race. It has a wonderful essay on kind of the new racism. It has an essay on anti-immigrant racism, but it also republishes some of Howard's work from the 1960s. Howard Zinn was at the grassroots writing about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and wrote some wonderful essays and passages. And I thought I'd conclude this evening by drawing on a couple of passages from Howard Zinn to try to come to grips with Stetson Kennedy's America and the kind of person that Stetson was. And again, you know by now, I don't think that we can sum up Stetson's life in the space of an evening or even in the space of a lifetime. And I think remembering Stetson is such an important thing to do because he is a reminder of what solid research and reading and writing can do. How these activities, how a book, I'm going to make this argument using Stetson. This book is as powerful as a picket sign. A picket sign is as powerful as this book. Dr. King said, education and social action must be joined together. If you try to isolate them, if you just involve yourself in social action and picketing and direct action and protest, without education, without research, you're wasting your time. And vice versa. Education without social action is equally empty. And this gets to Stetson's critiques of academics. Stetson was a very kind person. I remember asking him one time, or him telling me, and kind of doing this in a very kind of jovial manner. Well, Paul, I don't know what's wrong with you academics. I just think you're kind of slow. But he said it with a smile on his face. He was very kind about it. And his critique of people like Gunnar Myrdal was, again, not just the timidity, but the lack of faith in ordinary people and community organizing. You know, Stetson was involved in some direct action activities throughout his long life, and I'm sure we'll find more of these as we move forward and do research in his papers and that. But again, I feel that his primary gift to us, what came in this form. And I'm really going to challenge each of you to think about this. If you're students of the human condition, if you're teachers, community organizers, brothers and sisters, we need to pick up books again. We are surrounded by an amazing resource right here all around us. You can't learn this stuff by reading stuff on the internet. Believe me. And I always tell my students, please don't use Wikipedia as a citation source. Not because it's not useful at times, but it can't take you as deeply into the system if you're trying to understand both the system of oppression that is part of America, or equally critical, the traditions of struggle and social justice organizing. You can't get that stuff from the internet. In fact, we had take a group of students from the University of Florida to the Mississippi Delta every fall to interview veterans of the civil rights movement. And we participated in a community organizing workshop led by none other than the founding chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Lawrence Guillotte, an amazing organizer, one of the original members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Naila Summers, one of the students who sat there. What did Mr. Guillotte tell us about Facebook?
Disconnect. Facebook and Twitter is devil. You don't get to interact with people the same way that you used to. That is a loss for our generation.
Yeah, I mean, he said, pick one day out of the week and turn off your cell phone. Turn off your Facebook account. Turn off your, as he called it, your tweeter. Okay? And he said that it's not like he's an anti-technology absolutist, but he said that sometimes social media can serve as a buffer between people and can prevent real interaction, you know, real debate, real dialogue. It's easy to read an email or a Facebook post and get angry and say things that you wouldn't say if you were in the room with the person. Now that's bad community organizing. And that's why Lawrence Guillotte was telling us, he said, take a day and just put your cell phone away, put your Facebook away, and interact with people around you. That's kind of the start of community organizing. So the real conclusion. See, when you use the word conclusion, you trick people into thinking you're finishing. It gives you another 5 minutes. But I'm really concluding now. And I want to talk about cynicism and radicalism. If there's any man in this world who had the right, who deserved to be cynical, it was Stetson Kennedy. He lived to the amazing age of 94. He lost far more battles than he won. Far more. And yet, as far as I knew, in my interactions with him and in reading his prose, his wonderful prose, there wasn't a cynical bone in that man's body. I mean, he was disappointed in things, but he was not cynical because his spirit was renewed in the struggle, in the writing about injustice, in his passion against inequality, his desire for democracy. In remembering the kind of person that Stetson was, and here I'm going to paraphrase from a remembrance that I gave at the Oral History Association annual meeting in Denver last Saturday. Stetson had an unvanquished faith that ordinary people, that's us, possess the capacity to come together and to collectively organize to change the world for the better.
In remembering the kind of person that Stetson was, you're led back to another famous troublemaker, the historian Howard Zinn. In 1965, Howard wrote an essay titled Abolitionists, freedom riders and the tactics of agitation. And it's in that book, Race. It's a republished essay. This essay was a critique of historians who decried the passion of the 19th century abolitionists and the 20th century freedom riders in favor of moderation
and reasonableness. People are always telling Frederick Douglass, can't you be more reasonable? You know, John Brown, can't you be more moderate? I like to read two passages from this essay because Howard is describing the kind of person that Stetson was, the kind of historian, the kind of investigative reporter, and the type of activity I think that we as progressives should be trying to nurture. The historian Zinn noted, quote, too often moves back 100 years into a moral framework barbarian by modern standards and thinks inside it, while the radical shakes the rafters of this framework at the risk of his life. Wendell Phillips, speaking affectionately of the late abolitionist leader Angelina Grimke, said, were I to single out the moral and intellectual trait which most won me to her, it was her serene indifference to the judgment of those about her. That characterizes Stetson. He saw an injustice, oppression. He was indifferent to the people around him who said, Stetson, just let it go. Just let it go. It's just it's just reality. It's just, you know, we'll always have racism. We'll always have inequality. Stetson did not live that way. He did not accept that. And he was indifferent to people who tried to make him indifferent, right? At a family breakfast table sometime in the 1940s, Stetson's sister exclaimed in an exasperated manner, Stetson, I do believe you'd rather be with the Negroes than with us. To which Stetson replied, as a matter of fact, I would. He walked away from that table of privilege and comfort and kept on walking for the rest of his life. He was exiled from the land of his birth for nearly a decade because the Ku Klux Klan put a price on his head, a price I understand which is still there, ironically enough. Stetson Kennedy was a radical if you judge that term to mean that he believed in the transformative power of storytelling to promote social change and eventually revolution. While some academics may have problems with the term radical, we should turn again to Howard Zinn, who tells us, quote, the observer who is critical of the radical may be subconsciously conjuring the picture of a world peopled only with radicals, a world of incessant shouting, lamenting, and denunciation. But it would be good for him to also imagine a world without any radicals, a placid, static, and evil-ridden world with victims of injustice left to their own devices, a world with the downtrodden, friendless. In all ages, concluded Howard Zinn, it has been first the radical and only later the moderate who has held out a hand to people knocked down to the ground by the social order. Brothers and sisters, this is how Stetson lived his life. He lived his life for people who had been knocked down to the ground by the social order. And he did this relatively early in life. There are a lot of aspects of this which we can't get into tonight because we only have one evening. But again, please introduce yourself to this man by reading his works. Read Southern Exposure, read Jim Crow Guide, read Palmetto Country, read After Appomattox, and read the new book, Florida Slave Narratives. These will be transformative for you because Stetson did believe in the power of transformative storytelling. And storytelling is really at the basis of what we do as community organizers, right? It's not preaching, it's not proselytizing, it's not being a missionary, it's just telling a story about where I'm at, where are you at, let's come together. And if you look at Stetson's life and work, there's almost a seamless connection between his work as a folklorist. Think of Woody Guthrie, think of Billy Bragg, think of people who write about the oppressed, the friendless, people knocked down the social ladder, right? Those were people that Hughie Ledbetter or Leadbelly wrote about, sang about, Woody Guthrie, Billy Bragg, Stetson Kennedy. And in conclusion, the real conclusion, thank you for being patient, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes?
I have one. I was listening to you frame the arguments, and it seems to me that people talk about racism, talk about sexism, talk about all the things that people so part, it seems like it's elitism. It's what it's telling us mostly because, it separates us even more. It gives people a chance to have class warfare with people who don't look at them as different, but they are. They have
Yeah.
their own ends.
Yeah, in many ways, I think Southern exposure. I mean, that book is about, and he uses the term of class in there quite a bit. He talks about the domination of the society by the very wealthy, and elitism is very much a part of that, the critique. I mean, Stetson, there's certain, he had blind spots like we all do, right? And the powerful critiques about racism and class oppression aren't always complemented by a critique of sexual inequality, for example. But that's kind of up to us to kind of fill in the details in that particular case, right? But I think your point is very well taken, that whenever Stetson talked about racism, he always talked about the economy, who benefits, who does not benefit. Very good point. Oh, yeah. And Sandra is going to, see the mic too.
Thank you. This is such a treat because this man understands the context and the impact of what Stetson Kennedy did better than Stetson Kennedy did himself. And so thank you, Paul. And he has certainly done more to clarify for the public the real meat of Stetson's life. I wanted to share just a couple of stories with you because storytelling was at the very heart of Stetson's vehicle for social change. When you talk about the serene indifference of Stetson Kennedy to those around me, I want to let you know that extended also to his wife. In a situation that you are all familiar with, when a certain local pastor threatened to burn the Quran, Stetson sent word to the Alachua County Sheriff's Office that it was his intention that at the moment that the first flame was ignited on that document, that Stetson would make a citizen's arrest. Now, a citizen's arrest is a very seldom used and highly questionable practice. And so I thought I better educate myself about a citizen's arrest. What would that mean? And basically, for those of you who've never done it or never even thought about it, a citizen's arrest is when I would go up to you, and as you are committing the crime, it has to be in the moment. And I will say to you, you, Paul, are under arrest, and you must cease and desist what you're doing, and you must remain where you are until the nearest law enforcement official can take you into custody. Now, the Alachua County Sheriff's Office responded that Alachua County was not prepared for this kind of legal action. Well, I consulted with our attorney because if you carry out a citizen's arrest, you are personally, legally liable for those repercussions. I said to him, Stetson, do you realize that if you arrest this man and then a court of law decides, as the whole country, the country was paralyzed, the highest officials in the land didn't know what to do with this jerk, right? But Stetson had decided that he would carry out this act. I said, Stetson, do you realize that if you do this and a court of law determines that this was not a crime and you have illegally arrested this man, they can sue us for everything we own? And he said, yes. I said, well, then why would you put us all in this kind of jeopardy? And he said, because I know at the heart of it that he won't do it. And he said, I know how to outstunt a stuntsman. One of such stunts was right after World War II, the famous Krupp Corporation in Germany, and a number of other German industrialists decided that they were going to come to America and convince the local chambers of commerce and the industrial investors of America that it was time to reinvest in German manufacturing. Stetson was in New York at the time, and he went to a Jewish flag maker over in Brooklyn, and he wanted this flag maker to make him a swastika. Well, that was not a, and then he explained to the Jewish flag maker what he was going to use it for. So on the night in the fancy ballroom in a major New York hotel, Stetson fastened the swastika to the banisters of the mezzanine above their heads, so that as they came on the stage and started their talk, this huge swastika came down behind them. They canceled the rest of the tour. But I want to share with you an insight that I have learned in my 8 years with Stetson Kennedy. And that is basically this. Students would ask Stetson Kennedy, what advice would you give, particularly young people that wanted to write? And he would say to them, pick a cause and stick to it to the end. Now, Stetson had 3 causes, any one of which would be overwhelming or daunting to any of us. Human rights, however, in whatever form we encounter it. The stewardship of this planet and the preservation of traditional cultures. But what Stetson saw is that these are interrelated. By telling the stories of oppressed people, he used folklore as a vehicle for social change. He would recount the way that oppressed people were able to maintain their dignity and warn one another in times of oppression. One of those examples I gave in Paul's class. He recounts one of the black folks that he interviewed saying to him, you gotta feed white folks with a long spoon. Meaning, don't get too close. Don't ever believe that this is what that this constitutes a relationship. There's one of the sayings over on one of this, by the way, behind you is a depiction of Florida in 1942, as Stetson Kennedy had lived it. And one of those is a black mother warning her son, white kids will lick the honey off your bread and call you nigger. And so by recounting the stories, people who would otherwise not be amenable to hearing these messages had a way to do so. He also believed that it was from our cultural traditions throughout the world of how people lived in a sustainable world that should inform us how to live on this planet. Stetson inherited a large plot of land south of Jacksonville. Had it not been for that, he'd have starved to death because his writing never made any money. And whenever he would get impoverished, he would sell off another lot. And that allowed him to live, to have some support for most of his life. He put in deed restrictions that you couldn't change the contour of the land. If you bought one of his lots, you couldn't level the gullies that wildlife used to get down to the lake. He wouldn't let you couldn't cut vintage trees. He kept the canopy there to preserve the beauty of the land. And so he practiced himself. I think probably the best example of what Stetson Kennedy believed in practice is our friend Dale Kreider. Some of you here know Dale Kreider. He's a very, very well-known folk entertainer. He was a biologist with the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission and would go around singing songs about the environment. He lives out in Noonan Lake on the diet that the indigenous people who lived in that same spot would eat. He lives in a very rustic home that doesn't require air conditioning. It doesn't have a lot of the modern amenities, but he lives with nature in a way that makes very little impact on it. The golden braid of these three passions in Stetson Kennedy's life is the common good. Stetson had a real commitment to the power of our interrelatedness with each other. I don't have many regrets about my 8 years with Stetson Kennedy, but my greatest regret is that he didn't live 7 weeks longer, because if he had, we would be in New York. Okay? I wish my husband had lived to see ordinary people rise up and say, we, the people, the 99%. My only regret about the Occupy movement is the name. The name sounds like take over something that's not yours. The name sounds like challenge in some illegal or untoward way. If I could rename it, if I could get to every Occupy rally in America, I would say, this is not Occupy, this is we the people. You know, he loved Walt Whitman. In bed at night, he would quote Carl Sandburg. He had an unfailing trust in the uncommon good sense of ordinary people. And that was his great gift. That is his legacy. If you walk out of here with one idea tonight, I hope it would be Stetson's message to you that what we can do together can overcome the most serious problems we have in this country. But this business of vilifying people who disagree with you is not a way to go about doing the things we all need. So he loved democracy. And he ultimately, Stetson would say at the end of his talks, and so I'll make the end of mine, he would say to people, if any of you see a hopeful movement, call me collect.
And Joe, you wanted to transition to the, or there? Oh, Sandra.
This is a transition to Joe. Okay. I thought you might like to know why he put his books here. Books were his lifeblood. He spent every bit of the money he got out of selling his home to St. Johns County, which is now a museum. And it's also a beautiful meeting center, so if you are in any organization that needs a retreat, come to Beluthahatchee. Beluthahatchee is the word that Zora Hurston heard from African Americans in Florida back in the 30s for a place where discord is resolved and forgotten. And that is Blue the Hatchie. We struggled a long time, and we did a lot of research about what to do with his books, because his books were at the time shoved into the rafters. We sent 3,000 over here in the first round, wasn't it, Joe? Something like that. And then they kept sending 700 back, and then he would send 1,000 more, and back and forth it went. Why did we choose the Civic Media Center? Stetson wanted ordinary people to be able to have access to the very best information available. For a long time, we looked at the Highlander School. For those of you that are familiar with social activism, the Highlander School was the training ground for labor organizers, and it was the site where Dr. Martin Luther King met Rosa Parks years before she stayed seated on the bus. That was the site of the famous photograph that you saw that the Southern elite sent around, claiming it was a communist training camp because, the John Birch Society sent that around, claiming that it was a training camp. Stetson went to Highlander to be educated with the rest of them, and he had a bunk, and above the bunk were bullet holes. And so he got a little nervous about this, so he asked his hosts about the bullet holes, and they said, "Don't worry, if they come back, you'll be flat, you won't get hurt." And so the Highlander School has such a reputation among activists. It's kind of the Valhalla of where to go to be trained in social activism. So I said as we discussed bringing it here, the deciding factor for him was that he believed that this institution was more solid, would last longer than Highlander School, that this was a more reliable place for his treasures to go than was the most prestigious school for progressives in America. And so I always want to remind, I'm going to start every board meeting with that because this also has the advantage of just what you heard earlier about the history of this organization. What Charles said is right. This is in the face of the university, not on a mountaintop in Tennessee, but right here where we, the people, can use it. And so please know that while this space is humble in its appointments, it is powerful in the tools that you have in this building to individually and collectively make a difference.